Sir Walter Scott told this legend of the Scottish lowlands in the appendix of one of the Waverley novels. And he said that it happened many years ago. And given that Sir Walter has been dead these 180 years, I think we can safely say this happened many times, many years ago. Many times, many years ago, in the valley of the River Tweed, there lived a jolly horse trader who was primarily known for his love of gold and his affection for strong drink. Now, you and I don't have strong associations one way or another about horse traders, for good or ill. So it might help to think of Canobie Dick, for that was his name, as an olden day equivalent of a used car salesman. Not one of our nice local used car salesmen, but a used car salesman from one of those other places who have given that upstanding occupation an unsavory reputation. Well, one night, late in the evening, Canobie Dick was riding home across Bowden Moor, just west of the Eldon Hills, leading a couple of horses that he had been unsuccessful in selling that day. Now, he was so unhappy at not having been able to sell those two horses that he had stopped by the local public house for a pint of consolation. And that first pint had gone down so smoothly that he had a second pint, and perhaps another one after that. And so, being well consoled, he headed back out into the night. And so it was just at midnight that he was crossing Bowden Moor, and his horse came nose to nose with the horse of an elderly gentleman in antique dress, who, to his surprise, admired the two horses he was leading and asked their price. Now, Dick had always said that he would do business with the devil himself if he thought he could get a good enough bargain. So he gave as good as he got. And in good time, they arrived at a price they could both agree upon. And the strangest thing about the whole deal was that his counterpart paid in antique gold coins that hadn't been in common commerce for over 100 years. But gold was gold, and so Dick was happy enough with the deal, especially because he had thought he had gotten the better of the other man. And so he was happy to do business with him again. On other occasions, when he happened to encounter the same gentleman in the same location on Bowden Moor, always just at midnight. And over time, the curiosity began to rise in him about who this strange man was. So after one such midnight negotiation, Canobie Dick observed that a dry bargain is an unlucky one, and suggested that the courteous thing to do would be to invite a fellow home for a drink. And the mysterious stranger fixed Dick with an otherworldly stare and said, "You can come to my dwelling if you like, but if you lose courage at what you see there, you'll regret it all your days." Well, that was a strange enough thing to say to a man who had simply invited himself to your home for a drink, but Dick wasn't put off by it. He just smiled and said, "Let's have that drink, shall we?" And so the stranger turned the nose of his horse across toward the Eldon Hills and began to ride, and Dick followed. They rode across the moor and then across a field of oats, and they came to a stop at the foot of the Luck and Hare, a hillock known in those parts as a gathering place for witches. "Round and round the cauldron go, in the poisoned entrails throw." Well, On this particular night, there were no witches there, so they left their horses there at the bottom of the hill and continued on foot. They went up a path which switched back twice and came to a stop in front of a cave, which surprised Dick because he knew that area as well as he knew the inside of his purse, and he had never seen or heard of a cave in that location. But as he was thinking this, his host turned and looked over his shoulder at him and said, "You may still turn back." And Dick just said, "Lead on, old man." So in they went to the cave. And as his eyes adjusted, Dick saw that he was in a long corridor that was lit by torches on either side. And also on either side were rows of stalls. And in each stall was a horse, black as the devil's waistcoat, standing stock still like a statue, one right after the other. Dick walked by innumerable black horses until the passageway opened into a much larger hall that was more brightly lit. And in the center of the hall was a long, broad oaken table. And around the table sat a multitude of knights, each dressed in coal-black armor. And they were slumped over the table as if asleep, and the visor of each of their helmets was open, and their beards flowed out of the visor and interwove in the center of the table. And each of the knights held a sword, which they all fell together and crisscrossed in the center of the table like trees blown down in a big wind. And at the far end of the table stood an empty throne. And on the table in front of the throne were laid out a sword, a horn, and a leather pouch open at the neck to reveal a small fortune in gold. And Dick knew somehow that all this was meant for him and him alone. But he only had eyes for the gold. It seemed to speak to him. And as he began to reach for it, his host intoned, "He that wields the sword and sounds the horn shall, if his heart fail him not, be king over all broad Britain. But all depends on which you choose first." But Dick barely heard him, because all he could hear was the hum of the gold, and he just reached out and grabbed the pouch by the neck and hefted it in his hands. And as he did, all of a sudden there was a clatter and a clang, and he looked up, and all the knights were springing awake and brandishing their swords and looking around angrily. And beyond them, the horses had awakened too in the stalls and were battering at the sides and the door of the stalls to get out. And just then, he heard again the voice of his host, but multiplied. It seemed to come from every corner of the hall at once, and said, "Woe to the mortal with heart so cold, who cares for nothing so much as gold." And a cold wind blasted through the hall and picked Dick up as if he were no heavier than a feather, and blew him back the way he had come, over the table and down the long passageway, until it spat him out the mouth of the cave, and he tumbled over the precipice and came to a stop in a broken heap in the field of oats. And that's where he was found the next morning by a passing shepherd. And he had just enough breath left to tell this tale. And then he breathed his last. And ever since then, nobody has found that cave again. So it could be that this story is just the drunken delirium born of the dying thoughts of a drunkard. Or it could be that those knights and their steeds continue to sleep below the earth, waiting for just the right horse trader or used car salesman to come along and make the correct choice and become king over all broad Britain.